I am 77 years old. My name is Terry Walsh. In 1972, I was a production assistant on The Tonight Show at NBC in Burbank. I carried cables, moved equipment, fetched coffee, did whatever the floor needed done. I was nobody important, and that meant I could go places that mattered without anyone paying attention to me. I was in the studio the night it happened. I was backstage when it really happened. And I am the only crew member I know of who saw the whole thing from beginning to end without being told to look away. A BC didn't cut those 5 seconds because of a technical problem. What they cut was the beginning of something they had absolutely no framework for broadcasting. This is everything that happened that night.
The Tonight Show taped every weeknight at NBC Studios in Burbank. The building looked ordinary from the outside. Inside, it was controlled and fast, everybody moving with a purpose, the kind of organized chaos that produces 90 minutes of live television 5 nights a week without visibly falling apart. I had been working there for 8 months by the time that November came around. I knew the rhythms. I knew when a night was going to be smooth and when something was slightly off before the taping even started. That night was off from the moment I walked in. The first guest was a woman named Christine Fuller. She was 23 years old, from Cincinnati originally, trained in Taekwondo since she was 14. She had just won the first Women's National Taekwondo Championship in the United States, which was a real thing, a genuine first, the kind of athletic achievement that deserved attention, and got it. Sports Illustrated had done a small piece on her. A few morning shows had her on. She was articulate, she was confident, she was photogenic, and she was the story the booking team wanted to tell that week. I saw her in the hallway outside the green rooms about an hour before taping. She was easy to spot. Tall, athletic build, the posture of someone who has spent years being told to stand a certain way and has internalized it completely. She was talking to one of the segment producers, a woman named Diane, going over the format of her appearance. She had a kind of contained energy about her, focused, like a person who was used to walking into rooms and performing well in them and expected tonight to be no different. She was not wrong that she would perform well. She was wrong about what kind of performance the night had in store for her. What Christine did not know, what almost nobody except the senior production staff and Johnny himself knew, was that the second guest that night was Bruce Lee. He had been on the show once before, and the viewer response had been significant enough that Fred de Cordova had been trying to get him back for months. Bruce had one condition, the same condition he always had: no advance announcement. He wanted to come out as a surprise. Fred agreed. Johnny agreed. It made for better television, they both said. What nobody had thought through carefully enough was what it would mean to have Bruce Lee appear as a surprise guest on a segment where the first guest had just spent 10 minutes being introduced to America as the face of Asian martial arts coming to the United States. That oversight was going to cost everyone in that building about an hour of their evening. Bruce arrived at 5:30. I saw him come in through the side entrance, the one the regular crew used, the one that kept guests from running into each other in the main hallway. He was wearing a dark jacket, regular trousers, nothing that drew attention. He moved through the corridor with the particular quality he always had of being completely present without performing presence, if that makes sense. He knew exactly where he was going, and he went there without making anything of it. He got to his green room. I walked past about 20 minutes later, and the door was slightly open, and I could see him sitting in the chair with his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap. Not sleeping, just still. The way someone is still, when being still, is something they've actually practiced. Christine's green room was 3 doors down. I walked past hers too. She was up, moving around, going over notes, the preparation of someone who takes public appearances seriously and wants to be ready. Nothing wrong with that. Good instinct. The show started at 8:30. Johnny's monologue landed well that night. I remember that. He was in a good rhythm. First segment went smoothly. Then it was time for Christine. She came out and the crowd gave her genuine applause, warm and real. Johnny introduced her as the first Women's National Taekwondo champion in American history, which was true, and the crowd responded to it. She sat down in the guest chair with the ease of someone who had done enough media appearances to feel comfortable in that environment. Johnny asked her about the sport, about her path to the championship, about what Taekwondo was and why it mattered. She was excellent, clear, engaging, specific about the training, without being technical, in a way that lost the audience. She talked about how long the road had been, about the early years when there were no women's divisions at most tournaments, so she trained with the men, about what winning felt like. The audience was with her completely. Johnny was genuinely interested, asking real follow-up questions instead of just bridging to the next point. And then Johnny said the thing that Fred had told him to say at this point in the segment. He said, "You know, speaking of martial arts, I happen to have another guest tonight who I think you might have some thoughts about." He looked at the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, a good friend of the show, Bruce Lee. The curtain opened. The audience reaction was immediate and genuine. Not polite applause, real recognition, real excitement, the particular sound a crowd makes when someone walks out who they actually wanted to see. Bruce came through the curtain the same way he did everything. Even pace, no performance of confidence, just a man walking through a curtain toward a chair. He shook Johnny's hand. He nodded at Christine. He sat down. Christine looked at him. I was watching from the far side of the stage, near the camera 2 position, close enough to see faces. Christine's expression when she looked at Bruce was not hostile. Not yet. It was more like the expression of someone who has just been handed a situation they weren't expecting and are quickly figuring out what they think about it. She looked at him the way you look at something you're categorizing, trying to find the right mental drawer to put it in. Bruce looked back at her the way he looked at everything, calmly and with complete attention. Johnny steered the conversation toward the obvious topic. 2 martial artists on the same couch, 2 different backgrounds. What did they think of each other's disciplines? What were the differences? What were the similarities? Standard stuff. The kind of conversation that produces pleasant television and a few interesting moments without anyone getting hurt. For the first few minutes, it went exactly that way. Bruce talked about the roots of what he did, about Jeet Kune Do, about the philosophy of absorbing what was useful from different systems and discarding what wasn't. Christine talked about Taekwondo's emphasis on kicking, about the power generation possible from the legs versus the arms, about why the Korean tradition had developed the way it had. They were both articulate, and they were both interesting, and the segment was going exactly the way Fred had hoped it would go. Then Christine said something that shifted the temperature. It was almost casual, almost like she was just making a point about the industry, rather than about the man sitting next to her. She said that she thought it was interesting that the public face of martial arts coming out of Asia at that moment was primarily coming from film. She said she thought that created a particular perception problem, because film martial arts and real martial arts were different things, and the person the public was most associating with real kung fu was someone whose primary job was to make things look good on camera, rather than to actually fight. Johnny blinked. He had been in television long enough to hear when something had just gone sideways, and he'd been in this particular chair long enough to know how to handle it. He laughed lightly, the practiced laugh of a host redirecting, and he started forming the sentence that was going to take the conversation somewhere safer. Bruce spoke first. He said, "I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. Are you suggesting that what I do is primarily performance?" His voice was even, not defensive, the voice of someone asking a genuine question because they want the real answer before they respond. Christine held his gaze. She said, "I'm saying that the public knows you from movies, and movies, by definition, are not real fighting. The techniques are choreographed, the opponents know where to fall, and the camera can make anyone look like something they might not be outside of that controlled environment. I'm not saying you don't have skill. I'm saying the skill the public attributes to you might be more cinematic than actual." The studio was quiet, not silent. The ambient noise of a live studio never fully goes away, but the particular quality of quiet that descends when 400 people collectively realize that what's happening on a stage in front of them has just become real. Johnny leaned forward. He said, "Well, I think what Christine is getting at is..." Christine said, "I'm getting at what I said." Johnny looked at Bruce. Bruce had not moved. He was sitting in the same position he'd been sitting in, looking at Christine, with the same expression he'd had when she started talking. And then he said something that made the production team near camera 3 start moving. He said, "Before the movies, I had been teaching for 8 years. I had students who went on to become champions. I have developed a system of combat that is drawn from direct experience, with real contact, not rehearsed contact. I understand why the film work creates a perception, but the perception is not accurate." Christine nodded. She said, "I'm sure you believe that, and that, 'I'm sure you believe that,' is what did it." The dismissal in it was so clean and so complete that it landed in the room like a small dropped object that everyone heard, but nobody was sure whether to acknowledge. If you think that was the most dismissive thing she said in the first segment, wait until you hear what happened when they came back from commercial. Johnny called the break so fast it surprised even the floor director. He was up from behind his desk before the on-air light had fully changed, moving toward the couch with the particular speed of a host who has spent 30 years pulling conversations back from edges and knows he needs to get to this one right now. I was close enough to the edge of the set to hear what he said to Christine during the break. He kept his voice low and professional, but the message was clear. He said something like, "I need you to understand that what you just did is going to create a problem for this show if we let it continue, and I don't want it to continue. So when we come back, I need you to bring this down a level." Christine said, "I wasn't being disrespectful, I was being honest." Johnny said, There's a version of honest that's also civil. I'd like to use that version. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, okay. She said she understood. She said she would bring it down. She did not bring it down. The commercial ended. The on-air light came back. Johnny smoothed his jacket and settled into his professional warmth like pulling on a coat he'd worn for decades. He started the second portion of the segment by asking Bruce about the philosophy behind Jeet Kune Do, a safe question, a topic that would let Bruce speak at length without anything sharp having to happen. Bruce had been answering for maybe 40 seconds when Christine cut in. She said, I actually want to go back to something, because I think there's a real conversation to be had here about what martial arts legitimacy looks like in America right now, and I think the honest version of that conversation requires acknowledging that the people positioned as faces of Asian martial arts in this country right now are positioned that way because of entertainment, not because of verified combat ability. Johnny's jaw did something. Bruce turned to look at her. He said, verified how? Christine said, competition, sanctioned competition, against real opponents who are actually trying to beat you, under real rules, with real judges. That's how you verify combat ability. Not box office numbers. Bruce said, I've spent more hours in real contact training than most competition fighters spend in their entire careers. Christine said, training isn't competing. Bruce said, competing isn't the only way to test what works. Christine said, it's the only way that can be verified by anyone other than yourself. Bruce was quiet for a second, and then something shifted in his face. Not anger, not yet, something more like a door closing on patience. He said, what would satisfy you? She said, 1 round. Real contact. Let's see what you can do, Johnny said, in a voice that was managing 2 things at once, the audience and his own nerves. Now that's not something we're going to be able to, Christine said. I'm serious. You say you're a real fighter. I'm a national champion. Let's be real fighters together for 1 round, and let the audience decide what they're looking at. 400 people made a sound. If you think the moment she said that was the most electric thing that happened in that studio, what happened in the next 60 seconds will prove you wrong. Because Bruce Lee said, all right. Johnny actually stood up halfway, not all the way, more of an involuntary half-rise, the physical expression of a man whose instincts are telling him to get between something, but whose brain hasn't yet given him clear instructions on what exactly to do. He said, Bruce. Bruce said, she's asking a real question. She deserves a real answer. Christine looked at him. For the first time that night, her expression was something other than assured. There was a reassessment happening behind her eyes, quick and private. The look of someone running a calculation they'd assumed was going to produce 1 number and are suddenly uncertain it will. She said, right here, right now. Bruce said, if that's what you want. Backstage, I can tell you from being in the room next to the floor, the production team had split into 2 camps, inside about 30 seconds. One group, led by the segment producer Diane, was pushing hard to shut it down. She was on the earpiece telling Johnny to cut to commercial, telling the floor director to get security positioned, telling everyone who would listen that they were not going to air an unsanctioned physical confrontation between 2 guests on The Tonight Show, and that was final. The other group, smaller but louder in a specific way, was the people thinking about what the ratings would look like if this actually happened on live television. I watched this argument happen in real time about 12 feet from the studio entrance, 2 producers nearly chest to chest over a clipboard, one of them saying, we cannot, and the other saying, do you understand what this is? And neither of them getting a clean answer out before the situation resolved itself on its own. Johnny called commercial. The fastest cut in the history of that show, probably. The on-air light dropped, and the floor director was already moving onto the set, and security had appeared from somewhere, and was positioned between the couch and the open area of the stage. For a moment it looked like it was going to be contained, like Johnny was going to get them separated and calmed down, and the segment was going to end with everyone smiling tightly and promising the audience they'd been about to see something very exciting, but unfortunately, time constraints, and the show would move on. Then Christine said something into the empty air of the studio during the commercial break that everyone within 10 feet heard. She said, you back down, in front of 400 people. That tells me everything I needed to know. She wasn't even looking at Bruce when she said it. She was looking at her nails. I watched Bruce Lee's face when those words landed. I was 15 feet away, behind camera 2, and I had a clear angle, and what I saw happen in his expression was not the anger you'd expect. It was something quieter than that, and much more final. The look of a man who has made a decision, and the decision is very simple, and he is done discussing it. He stood up. He said, not here, follow me. He walked off the set. Christine stood up. Johnny said, nobody is. But he was already talking to Christine's back, Because she was following Bruce, and neither of them was stopping. I followed, not because anyone told me to. Because I was 25 years old and I had a clear path, and I was not going to stand in a studio hallway and wonder what was happening while it was happening 30 feet away. The backstage corridor at NBC Burbank in 1972 was narrow, fluorescent lit, concrete floor, the functional skeleton of a building whose public face was somewhere else. It smelled like cable insulation and old coffee. There was a loading area off the main corridor that the crew used for equipment staging, about the size of a large living room, mostly empty that time of night, a few road cases stacked along one wall. Bruce went in there. Christine followed him in. I stopped at the doorway. One other crew member, a camera operator named Greg, who had followed the same instinct I had, stopped next to me. We stood in the doorway and watched. Christine pulled her hair back and kicked off her heels. She was in her stocking feet on concrete. She settled into a stance, the wide athletic base of a Taekwondo fighter, hands up, weight balanced. She looked ready. She looked like what she was, a trained national champion who had been doing this for 9 years. Bruce was standing in the middle of the loading area in his jacket. He had not removed the jacket. He had not changed his posture from the posture he'd had walking through the hallway. He looked like a man waiting for a bus. She came at him. She threw a front kick, fast and committed, aimed at his midsection, the kind of technique you open with when you want to establish range and see how your opponent handles early pressure. Bruce was not where she kicked. He had moved, and the specific thing about the way he moved was that it didn't look like defensive movement. It didn't look like he was avoiding her kick. It looked like he had simply decided to be somewhere slightly different than where he'd been, and the kick had gone to where he used to be, and now he was next to her committed leg, and his hand was at her shoulder, the lightest possible touch, but applying exactly enough direction at exactly the wrong moment for her balance. She went down, not hard, controlled. Her knee hit the concrete, and her hand caught her, and she was up again almost immediately. She looked at him. He was standing where he'd been, or somewhere very close to it, and his jacket was still on, and his expression had not changed. She came again, this time a combination, front kick to set up a spinning back kick, the kind of sequence that had won her the championship, because most people couldn't handle the transition between the two techniques at the speed she threw them. Bruce slipped the front kick the same way he'd slipped the first one, the same small lateral movement that relocated him relative to the kick rather than removing him from the exchange, and when the spinning back kick came, he was inside it, too close for it to generate force, and his hands did something at her hip and shoulder simultaneously that introduced a direction into her spin that she hadn't chosen. She went down again, this time onto both hands, catching herself at the last second. She stayed down for a moment, not hurt, processing. She got up and looked at him, and her expression had changed completely. The assurance that had been there all night, the cool certainty that had produced every dismissive thing she'd said in that studio, was gone. Not replaced by anger, not replaced by humility. Just gone, stripped away, leaving something more uncertain and more honest underneath it. She said, "How are you doing that?" Bruce said, "What specifically?" She said, "I can't find you. I'm looking at you, and I throw, and you're somewhere else." Bruce said, "You're looking at where I am. Try looking at where I'm going." She considered this for a moment, then she came again, slower this time, more deliberate, trying to read him before committing. She threw a testing jab, something to get a response from, to see how he moved in response to something small before she committed to anything large. He didn't move away from it. He moved with it, slightly, just enough to take the force out of the contact without removing himself from the exchange, and his response was a single palm strike, controlled and precise, that connected with her shoulder with enough specific force that her entire right side stopped doing what she'd told it to do, for about a second and a half. She sat down on the concrete, not fell, sat, like the decision had been made, below the level of her conscious control, and she was catching up to it as it happened. She sat there for a moment, and then she did something I had not expected and did not fully understand until later. She started crying, not from pain. Nothing he'd done had hurt her in any significant way, from something else. Something that happens when a person who has been very certain about something for a very long time is shown in the space of about 90 seconds that the certainty was incomplete. The crying was quiet and brief, and she pulled herself back from it fast, but Greg next to me in the doorway saw it too, and I know from talking to him later that he was as surprised by it as I was. Bruce did something then that I think about more than the fighting itself. He sat down on the floor, across from her, not above her, not standing, not offering a hand down from a standing position. He sat down so they were at the same level, and he said, quietly enough that I had to lean in slightly to hear it from the doorway, "You're good. The kicks you threw in the studio demonstration were clean and fast and real. What you've built is real. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She said, "Then why can't I touch you?" He said, "Because you've trained to fight people who fight the way you expect people to fight. The patterns you know are good patterns. I just don't fit them." She said, "That's not a skill. That's just being unpredictable." He said, "Unpredictable is a skill. Maybe the hardest one. Anybody can learn a technique. Very few people can make themselves genuinely hard to read." She was quiet. He said, "What you said tonight in there, about film and legitimacy." She said, "I stand by it." He said, "I know you do. That's why I followed you back here." She looked at him. "So you had something to prove." He said, "No. You had something to prove, and you were going to carry that around until it got answered. Better to answer it." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." He said, "What did you expect?" She said, "Someone who needed to win." He said, "I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to show you something." She said, "What?" He said, "That the conversation you were having with me tonight was based on something you'd decided before you walked into that studio. You'd decided what I was, what film martial arts was, what the whole thing meant, before you had any real information about it. I'm not angry about that, but you were going to spend a long time being wrong about it if nobody showed you something different." She looked at the floor. She said, "What if I said I wanted to understand what you do? Not to fight it, to understand it." He said, "I'd say, come to my school." She looked up. "You'd teach me." He said, "I'd teach anyone who's actually asking, instead of just deciding." Greg pulled at my arm at that point because we could hear footsteps coming down the corridor, security and producers finally converging on where we all were, and neither of us wanted to be found, obviously eavesdropping in a doorway. We moved back down the corridor and blended into the crew movement that was already filling the space. I saw Christine come out of the loading area about 5 minutes later. Her heels were back on. Her face was composed. She walked past me without looking at anyone and went in the direction of her green room. I don't know what happened in the green room after that, because I was needed back on the studio floor for wrap-up. What I know happened afterward is from what I pieced together over the next few days, from various people at the show, from what Diane told me during a smoke break 2 days later, and from one thing I saw with my own eyes. The segment aired without the last portion, the part after the second commercial break, where things had escalated. The official reason given internally was segment length and scheduling. The 5 seconds that ABC pulled were the 5 seconds between Christine saying, "You won't last one round with me," and Bruce saying, "All right," because those 5 seconds contained enough of what was about to happen that the network standards team, once they reviewed the tape, decided they didn't want to be in the business of having aired the beginning of something they were going to have to explain. The East Coast had seen it live, the West Coast did not. The calls to the NBC switchboard that night were, according to Diane, more than anything the show had logged in over a year, and almost all of them were asking the same thing. What happened after the camera cut? Nobody who worked on the show was supposed to say, "I didn't say anything for a long time." The last thing I saw with my own eyes that night was Bruce Lee in the parking lot at about 11. He was heading to his car, bag over his shoulder, the same jacket, the same even pace as always. I was loading equipment into a crew van parked 2 spots away. I wasn't going to say anything, wasn't going to make him stop and have a conversation when he was clearly heading home after a long evening. But he saw me look, and he knew I'd been in the doorway. I could tell that he knew, and he gave me a nod. One nod, the kind that means I know what you saw, and that's fine, and let's leave it at that. I nodded back. He got in his car and drove away. I thought about that nod for a long time afterward. I still think about it. He'd been called a fake in front of 400 people, had gone backstage and done what he needed to do, had then sat on a concrete floor and had a real conversation with the person who'd said it, and then walked out to his car and driven home like it was just a Tuesday. Because for him, I think it probably was. That's everything I saw. That's the whole night. I've been a crew member, then a floor director, then a producer at 3 different networks over the past 50 years, and I've been in a lot of rooms where interesting things happened. Nothing has stayed with me the way that loading bay did. 45 square feet of concrete floor and fluorescent light, where one person asked a real question and another person gave a real answer, and neither of them needed a camera to do it. That's the story.